Okay, give that a second to load. So a number of years ago, it's actually been about 7 years now, since we began doing some research on the Florence Farming Association. And this is kind of a document of me sort of documenting my process and how we came to kind of come to some conclusions. And, you know, one of the big goals was to receive a historic roadside marker. And that's what you see in the picture there. So I'll kind of tell you how we got to that point. And some additional goals that we had established was to essentially, my goal as an educator is to build excitement for history. And that process is involved also building excitement for historic preservation by engaging youth as well as the community. And this project has really been my introduction to the world of public history from a different perspective than when I was sitting on boards with the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum. So the Florence Farming and Lumber Community or Association, as it's referred to as many things similar. It's identified in the Florence Hill Forest, which is actually New York State Forest. It was a small 19th century settlement of both freedom seekers and free blacks who had established a communal farmstead in Florence through the help of many local abolitionists, namely Stephen Myers, whose name is highlighted on the sign, as well as Gerrit Smith, who's a prominent abolitionist from Peterborough. Initially, our process began with a general curiosity and passion. My librarian and I attended a BOCES workshop in which we were taught how to use primary and secondary sources that were housed at the local archives. I also was aware of the Florence farming settlement through my volunteerism at National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum, and through a lot of sort of mutual relationships and shared interests, got in touch with some friends that had these similar interests. So this is my librarian and I on our initial journey. We were part of this workshop. It was phenomenal. It was put together by the local Madison County historian, Madison Oneida BOCES, Diana Wendell. Big thanks to her. I know that she's on this call, as well as New York State Archives educator Jordan Mall. So initially we were asked to complete a research project to locate documents, historic documents that could be utilized in the classroom, the end product goal being, create some type of document analysis activity. And Janine, my librarian, and I decided, she was pretty much game for anything. So we decided that we were going to try to find out more about the Florence Farming and Lumber Association. And it really started with these two men. We knew Gerrit Smith had land. We knew that Stephen Myers is involved in the endeavor. And we wanted to try to locate the deed of Gerrit Smith selling the property to Stephen Myers. So that was our simple goal, locate this deed. We were afforded the opportunity to actually head over to the Oneida County office building, and to go down into the basement and to, search for this document, which we were able to find. And we were probably perfectly content to stop there. But this was such an exciting find for us that we wanted to do more, and as time would allow it, we would. Now, if you are ever utilizing documents like this, they can be very challenging to read. So I do recommend, if you are in person, doing the transcription right there while you're in front of it, because it can be challenging to document a transcription from a photograph. In order to further, continue our research, there was lots of further contextualization that would generate the viability of doing more research. So some background for those that may not be aware of, what that contextualization is that, this is an area where we live in central New York that is a hotbed of abolitionist activity throughout the 1830s and 60s. Our proximity to the Erie Canal, significant underground railroad stops throughout this region. The founding of the New York State Anti-Slavery Society, initially established in Utica, and the meeting continued in Peterborough in October of 1835. And then lots of abolitionist activism in the area. Again, namely, our research kind of centered initially around Gerrit Smith and Stephen Myers, but there's a wealth of letters even between Stephen Myers and Frederick Douglass in regards to this property. There's also a number of abolitionist newspapers, and then we have surviving structures that still have that abolitionist activity that took place as well. So our question was, can we find additional historical documentation that would support the existence of the Florence farming settlement? And can we locate where the settlement was? Where was it? And again, like, the interest that I had behind this was because I knew about this place, but my students, Florence is part of our school district that we work in. And I was unable to answer my students when they followed up and said, okay, where in Florence? I live in Florence. And that, I found that frustrating that I couldn't answer that question. And so we were so incredibly fortunate to be invited to attend an exploratory trip on state land. And huge thanks to Paul and Mary Liz Stewart for organizing this trip. And this is going to be a number of people are involved. They brought with them this cadre of just phenomenal professionals from the New York State DEC, Historic Preservation, and foresters, as well as the New York State Museum and archaeologists. Our first step was to sort of map out and decide what we were going to look at. And one of the things that we ran into potential issue was that we really had to stay on state property. So if you do venture up that way, you need to make sure that you're mindful of the markers on the trees and do not venture off of the state land or you will be trespassing. And so we were really fortunate in that much of what we wanted to look at was on state property. And again, a lot of this research was done by some of the folks that Paul and Mary Liz brought out. And at that point, Janine and I were really just kind of along for the ride, and they very much got this ball rolling. So for those of you that don't know where Florence is located, the map on the left is a picture of Oneida County, and Florence is in the northwestern corner. In terms of proximity to Peterborough, which is where Gerrit Smith lived, that is located in Madison County. So I wanted to kind of show you that connection between the two. And this is the map that got the ball rolling in a lot of ways. So this 1858 map, Gillette's map, pretty well known, and it is digitized versions are accessible. And I believe Rebecca said that you guys have a digitized version through the History Center.
There's one now on the Library of Congress, I think, okay, which is really great. Good quality. You can zoom in really good close. We have a physical copy, which is
physical copy.
Yeah.
So this is just such a phenomenal map, and we're so incredibly lucky that the way that this map was drawn out was that they identified the names of property owners at that time. So what we could then do is cross-reference these names with the census data from the 1850s, New York State census data from 1855, and 1860 census data. And what you see highlighted on the left are African Americans. And we know that they're African Americans because the census data identified them as such. So the, there's a lot of corroborating evidence. And again, if we kind of zoom in, we can see that they are living in a cluster. Now, this, where you see Washington and Young's, that is basically the state land. Now, Stephen Meyer's property actually speaks about a lot 15, which would, take it sort of out of that picture. Stephen Meyer's name is not on the map. It doesn't mean that he, didn't live there, but we don't have any, at least physical evidence to show where that might have been. So we decided that we were going to focus on the state land. And again, this comes from, the professionals that came out from Albany and invited us on their journey, just to kind of do some initial exploratory research. When we first went out, we primarily looked at the Washington site, and that, just to basically see on that first trip that there was evidence of, physical structures, human activity, artifacts, so that we could further decide if this was viable to do, any more research. Over time, and really over the following year, I applied for a William G. Pomeroy Foundation roadside marker. And some of the evidence that I used to prove that was this cluster of homes, and again, identifying, Gerrit Smith sold property to Stephen Myers, Gerrit Smith sold property to Daniel Benton, Benton sold to Joseph Youngs. And as well as, eventually, finding Florence property tax records and census data. So there's such an assortment of evidence that we were able to really tell that picture. And again, keep in mind, what you're putting on the sign is pretty limited. There's so much more to the story than what is on a roadside marker, which is why I'm really very grateful to have this opportunity to share this story with you. Some of the African-American residents on the settlement, and this is by no means an exhaustive list, because at some point there may have been as many as 75 African-American residents living on the land. And but these are some of the names that we see on the map. So we're going to kind of stick to those names, and that those are the physical properties that we can actually kind of walk through. I included the deed to from Gerrit Smith to Daniel Benton, because again, we wanted to be able to tell the story of the community. And even though Stephen Myers was the major promoter of the community, we don't necessarily have physical evidence at this time of where he might have lived on that property. But the map shows us that this other cluster could indeed be what we would consider a community for all intents and purposes. And so in sticking with the Gerrit Smith, Benton, Young story, Gerrit Smith sells the land to Benton. Benton is also African-American. Benton is going to continue to live on the land, but Benton will also sell some land to a Joseph Young. And again, we have these deeds, and what's helpful about the deeds is it explains the precise location. Sometimes they give geographical notes. For example, in the Joseph Young deed, it mentions southeast corner of W.T. Brown's 5 acres. So sometimes you have to know who are the neighbors in order to be able to figure out where these properties might have been. Now, fortunately, my colleague Janine and I, when we first uncovered that first Gerrit Smith, Stephen Myers deed, we took that deed right to the tax map office, and we said, okay, can you tell us where this land is today? And they kind of laughed at us because, here we were, these sort of goofy, innocent teachers expecting that they're just going to hand over this information for the good of learning and our students. And they said, we get paid a lot of money to do things like that, and that's what assessors do. And we begged and told them it was for the good of education, and they kind of took some time out of their schedule and helped us out, which was phenomenal, and we're grateful for that. So we were at least able to, you know, justify that, you know, this map, you know, where is the rough, precise location that Stephen Meyer's land would have been. And again, it's in this ballpark. It's on a different lot, but it's, you know, it's very close. It's on a neighboring lot to the Washington and Young properties. So if we were to go there today, this map on the top right is the Google Map image, and this is Florence Hill Road. The road on the left, the crossroad, is Maple Hill Road, and the road on the right is Mulvaney Road. Now, Mulvaney Road is not an actual functional road, it's a state access road. And so if you go up to this property, the land has been pretty much reverted back to its pre-settlement condition in a lot of ways. It's been reforested, and there's, you know, just if you are not aware, to the average onlooker, you might think it's just a forest. But there's a lot more going on under these trees. So again, I'm just going to bounce back. You'll notice the map here where the Washington and Young property is actually off of what today is Mulvaney Road. Okay, so we do see that connection, that footprint. Now, we also have evidence of what the land might have been like back then. In the Walter Hawkins biography, he has a whole chapter on Florence, and he references the land, he references, you know, what would have been done. They built log cabins, they converted bark into money. What they mean by that is they worked with selling off the bark to be manufactured into potash. They would send the timber to sawmills. And, you know, again, this is kind of Walter Hawkins' references the bitter cold, and anybody that's been to Florence knows that that is a harsh reality. In an excerpt from a letter to Frederick Douglass from Stephen Myers, he references the geographic features. And a letter like this is important to talk about, you know, its proximity, what they're doing with the land, but it doesn't tell us too many specifics about, you know, the land itself. So, you know, this is great though, to have a letter like this back and forth, you know, to Frederick Douglass, talking about what they're doing. And, you know, he's trying to sell, in a lot of ways, you know, sort of sell the concept of this Florence settlement, because remember, Stephen Myers is promoting this settlement, and Frederick Douglass controls a major newspaper, Abolitionist Press of the North Star, and, you know, he's looking to Frederick Douglass to also promote it. We know that the land would have been used pretty extensively for the timber, and again, it's the Florence Farming and Lumber Association. And so some of the things that they would have done with the lumber, the logs themselves would have been used to create the upper portions of buildings, but they would have used rock foundations. Lumber was harvested and sold to mills near Rome. The wood would be burned for heat in the winter, and the bark could be used as well. And there was an industry that worked with potash. Again, these are actual structures that you can still see there today, and we'll talk a little bit about why they are still there after all of this time. But the rocks would be removed from the surface of the soil. The endeavor was, they were intending to farm, and so you need to get the rocks out of the soil so that they can have more productive soil. Once the land was cleared, farming is going to become the foremost use of the land, and the crops that they would have worked with would have been corn, oats, and hay, with animals grazing in pastures. We have still, there on the land, lots of evidence of the use of the land. Water would have been drawn from a nearby spring, and there are a number of wells, as well as evidence that those are still there, that would have been dug and lined with stone. Cellars were dug for food storage, and we also have evidence on the land of fruit orchards being planted, because there is at least one apple tree that is on the property. This was a map created by Matt Kirk, who is the archaeologist that volunteers his time to work with us on this project. And this was kind of a rough sketch that he made based off of our initial exploratory visit. And over time, we've sort of added to this as well. And we use this as a guideline to, what are we going to look at next? What sites will we, move the metal detectors over? There's very little water, but there are some shallow springs, and depending on the season or the time of year that you're there, you will have, it's a little bit less accessible because it can get flooded in some of the lower lying areas. And there are parts of this that are very, very swampy. And some students, some years, have had the disadvantage of finding that out, more so than other years. These are some other images of the land today. There are some clearings that, from the remaining fields. And the soil, though, is quite rocky. Mulvaney Road is a minimally maintained dirt road that is essentially, for the state to be able to access this property. It's a public forest, so hunting is permitted. So you also, if you ever do go up there, want to make sure that you're looking into, the DEC guidelines and make sure that you're safe and properly dressed if you're going to be walking the land, and bring a buddy. So some big questions that my students always asked was, what happened to the land when the farms failed? So the association abandoned farming in the early to mid 1850s. So you might be thinking, wow, that was really quick. Why did it not work out so well? Yeah. There's a number of reasons that would contribute to that. First of all, many of the pictures I showed you show that it's actually not the best land for farming. And the elevation is pretty high. Florence is just at the base of the Tug Hill Plateau, and the winters are long and the growing season is short. There's high snowfall totals, which would even further shorten the growing season. And it is pretty remote, even though they had, proximity and use for neighboring Camden and Rome. They still would have, it still would have been a challenge to get access to those places. So it was hard to get people to continue to come there. And when Frederick Douglass at one point kind of changes his mind on promoting this settlement and reverts back to, no, I don't think it's a good idea. He goes as far as to refer to the Florence settlement as a boondoggle, as, just terrible land, and that it's not a good investment for people. There's more to be further uncovered, I feel like, with the, deterioration of the Myers-Douglas connection and the letters between them. But we also know some other contributing factors would be the Compromise of 1850. The Compromise of 1850 is going to strengthen the Fugitive Slave Act, which would likely have had an impact, because even in upstate New York, Florence, New York, if you were a freedom seeker that had settled here, you were no longer safe after the passage of the Compromise of 1850. So those would be some of the contributing factors to why the farms failed. And, even Walter Hawkins is going to end up moving to Canada and doing great things there and becoming a preacher there. But many are going to move on. And again, there's so much more that could be researched to start to uncover the actual lives of some of the men and women that lived on this settlement, even though it was such a short period of time. Now, fortunately for our research purposes, this land was owned after the, many of the Black families had left. Some of them, they weren't able to continue to pay taxes, so they lost the property. Some sold. But this man, James Riley, ended up with a large portion of this land and continued to live on it until he passed away. Now, the state allowed for a life use on a portion of the land, but then everything else would have reverted to the state. In the 1930s and 40s, the state was purchasing land and converting it to state forests all over the place as part of the CCC as well. So we do actually see that this land was reforested by the CCC, and you can still see evidence of that. Our foresters that were with us on some of these trips, were easily able to identify the trees, the lines of white pine and red pine in these neat rows that identified, look, this was reforested by the CCC. So we've made this a school project, and in a lot of ways we've made this all about public history. So, teachers, students, community members coming together to participate in archaeological fieldwork experience. With the guidance of professionals in this field, the DEC, the New York State Museum, and it has basically blossomed into this beautiful ongoing research project that we take, once a year we go out and do this fieldwork experience. Students are given the opportunity to participate in any of the things listed here, flagging artifacts, sketching scaled drawings, measurement, working with a team, identifying material artifacts, through the use of metal detectors and observation, documenting GPS coordinates, taking lots of photos, interpreting the evidence, communicating their findings or theories, and really working side by side with experts and professionals that are in this field. So it's been a phenomenal experience, and it's been great to see the collaboration and the teamwork with the students in just a real world, hands-on sort of way. Keep in mind that all of the work must be permitted through the New York State DEC because it is state property. And so we try to make sure that we are following all of the sort of expectations when you're interacting with state land, carry in, carry out, leave no trace. And all artifacts, have to really stay there. So you can see it, observe it, mark it, in terms of identify it, but it stays behind. And, some of the reason for that is because for future people to study this land and the artifacts, we need them to be able to interpret the context of, where the artifact was found and what it can tell us about the space. So there's a lot of challenges with working with an archaeological site in the forest on state public land that is not, protected at all from potential poachers coming up and trying to just help themselves to some of these artifacts. So we hope that, by working with students and community members, we can at least teach the importance of stewardship of public land and stewardship of these resources and public history. So we have, just years worth of, groups coming together, and, it's a challenging environment to work in. And I know that it's asking a lot of students to sort of go out into the woods. Many of them are overcoming and tackling some of their own personal fears with, being in an environment they're not used to working with. But we find jobs for everybody as best we can. And so you see students working with observation, flagging material artifacts, and all of this, they're taught and working alongside professionals like our archaeologist, Matt Kirk, and any of the other volunteers that he brings with him. And in this photo on the right, you see one student holding a bucket of 3 different colored flags. And so this team, what they were doing is they were identifying different substances that came up on the metal detector. So the metal detector identified, potentially 3 different types of metals, and they would flag it based on that difference. A next team would come through and they would use GPS coordinates, and they would plot it into the GPS unit of what was the, basically the predicted compound or type of metal that they might have had identified there. So all that gets tracked, and you'll see here you've got those different colored flags. And so when you pull all those GPS coordinates together and the descriptive information that the students plug in, it ends up telling you a more whole story. And what's unfortunate is that when the students are throwing flags in the ground and plotting GPS coordinates, they don't necessarily see that whole story at the time. And over the last, really 4 or 5 years that we've been taking students up here, we've been able to kind of tell more and more of that story, so that each year the students, I think, appreciate the impact that they're having a little bit more. So we have students that are measuring out, mounds of dirt. Now, students just walking in the woods might have thought, well, this is just a mound, what is it? But we're teaching students to ask the questions and to, look for evidence of human, interaction or material artifacts. And so all of this gets measured and sketched out, and, they're working in small teams. So here's the other view, and this is one of the students working on writing those scale drawings. You can see that she's essentially learning how to make a map. Now, this particular student, some of these students that we snagged for this were art students. And, we said, look, we need somebody to draw. And they really didn't know what that was going to entail, but they learned some new art skills along the way here. And we have, this is a different year. Again, students sketching out, and the adults giving some feedback on that. But these are the kind of structures that you see. You'll notice in the background, there's garbage, there's tires. We can't even take those things off the property because it's state property. And, what we can do is we can, when we're there with the DEC, they make a note of it, and they can, get somebody down there to clean that site up a little bit. But because it's so remote, and it's heavily used by hunters and fishermen and outdoorsmen and women, there does happen to be that lack of supervision, and sometimes it becomes a dump site. And so again, tires in the background, but these are entire walls of what was probably a barn, okay? And that's what they identified there. And, the top part, the second floor, would have been a wood structure, and that obviously doesn't survive. When the state takes over the land, they essentially burn all the structures for safety. And, the students are able to find artifacts sometimes that have been melted, and they, identify that these artifacts have been gone through, it looks like this has gone through a fire, and then we explain why. Picture on the right, we have a well, and picture on the left, this is another view of the barn. And it's helpful to have the student in the picture for scale even, so we know how big the structures are. Another view of the well. And these are some of the artifacts that we found. Most of what we had found is some type of farming implements, and that's what you see here. And again, we have to leave these things behind, but we do mark them in the GPS coordinates, and we identify them as best we can, so that then we at least know, okay, a farming implement was identified or found in this location, and that might tell us that this might have been a shed or a barn. Now, there are a lot of contemporary objects that do not fit the historic narrative of the research. They can still assist in developing further context of the land use. We know that James Riley lived on the land until he passed away, and then the state took the land over and burned the remaining structures. So they do still tell part of that story. And then we also know that even though it was state property, there's some of the evidence here that would have been left behind by outdoorsmen interacting with the land. My colleague Janine and I wanted to share with the public and anybody that was interested in, watching a presentation like this, some recommendations if you were interested in conducting your own local history research, which again is one of my passions, is to build that excitement for historic preservation through youth and community engagement. And so essentially our advice to you would be to start with a topic that is of interest to you. Try to read some broad historical narratives about the topic. Identify your local history resources and the places that you can access them. Just like we would recommend our students, we would recommend the public apply some historical thinking skills to analyze those sources, interpret and potentially publish your information, publish your research, and feel free to cross disciplines in order to interpret history. So for example, one of the things that made this a successful project was the fact that we did have foresters and historic preservation and our friends who are sociologists and archaeologists and historians. So by crossing, academic disciplines, we were able to tell new aspects of the story. And I think that also highlights different career opportunities for students. So we also recommend that if you're going to conduct local research, establish partnerships. And a great place to start is, of course, teachers and librarians, because this is an area that we have an interest in, and this is where our initial research blossomed from. But at least for Underground Railroad research, there's a list of a number of activities and groups, and I've shared this out. I don't know if the links will be live or if this will get posted somewhere, but if they do, everything's hyperlinked here, and so you could check out all these sources. And, local colleges too, your local BOCES, town, village, government historians, all of which can be very helpful in establishing partnerships. Everyone could use a little sprucing up on their own historical thinking skills. And in the teacher in me, I need to make sure that people know how to think like a historian. And there's some phenomenal resources out there that we utilize in the classroom, but the general public can certainly benefit from having the ability to sort of think with that historical lens and mindset. And so, for example, historical thinking skills is all about knowing the types of questions to ask. And this is a sample of some of the things that we would go through with students. And eventually, the more that students access this information and ask these questions, the goal is that they go out into the world being able to think in this way as well, asking lots of questions about sourcing, and hey, there's definitely a need for being able to verify sources, because we are living in a world where there's a lot of misinformation out there. So these are skills that will be useful throughout the rest of their lives. And so these are some of the resources that we used as well. There's lots of great databases, and that includes, the New York State collections, New York State archives, New York State Library digital collections, and of course your local libraries as well, and your local historical societies. You can also go national. So you may think that, there wouldn't be local resources at a digital collection at the national level, but in fact there is. And as Rebecca pointed out, that Gillette's map is on Library of Congress, a digital collection, and you can zoom right in and check that out. So there's actually a lot. You just have to know the questions to ask. And there's also collections of historic newspapers. Probably the most notable one is Fulton History, and then there's a great database which I think you have to pay for, but America's Historical Newspapers, and Ancestry has some access. If you live in New York, you have some access to Ancestry.com without a subscription, because New York State, in order to share New York State records, worked out a deal with Ancestry to basically make that free and accessible to New York residents. And know the challenges that you're facing with any type of research. Accessibility to research materials is a very real challenge. And, some of that is because you have, limited digitized collections. Some of it is you have the actual collection. I went into the Oneida County Archives building, and they actually have two sites for Oneida County Archives. One of them is accessible to the public, the other is not, and you essentially have to make an appointment, and it's hard to get in there. When you do, there isn't necessarily a finding guide, and it's just a large warehouse with lots of boxes, and it can be overwhelming. So I happened to find one box that was on Florence, and it was literally the exact decade I needed. And it was the Florence tax records from essentially 1850 to 1859. And so that was just a really lucky find. But, you just got to sort of push those, push for the access that's out there, because this is all, for the public and in the interest of public history and historic preservation. Keep asking questions, know the questions to ask, but sometimes the right person to ask it to doesn't come along right away. And so when when we first started looking into doing the roadside marker, I had literally a middle school technology teacher walked into my classroom and said, "Hey, I heard you're doing research on Florence. And I've lived there for 6 generations, and I would like to be involved." And then just knowing, having access to a person that's family lived there for 6 generations was a foot in the door to then getting permission to put the roadside marker on the side of the road in Florence, because it just so happened that his father, and family members served on the Florence town board. So that kind of opened up those doors. So, ask questions, make sure that friends and family know what you're researching, because in the big scheme of things, people want to help. People get excited about the research that people are doing, and they all sort of get sucked into that mystery. And so that's what I think makes it such a valuable endeavor. And that's the public in public history, is that, everybody's kind of on the same team here about preserving these things. Now, for us, we were working in an archaeological site, and that can be challenging depending on the environment. For us, we did have some accessibility issues. We have to plan our trip around the weather, the climate, this time of year, DEC guidelines and laws. We have to get permits and permission. And we, of course, try to maintain those relationships with the DEC, because they do support our educational research, but then there's also guidelines and laws that have to be followed. And other challenges that people might face with doing research is that, we went into this with a very limited experience or skill set in this area, and don't let that overwhelm you. Don't feel like you can't do local research just because you don't know how to. There are so many people that are out there that will help, and we went from being, a classroom teacher and a librarian to really, going all in on this project. And it didn't consume our whole lives, but it was a big project when we went out once a year. So, it's something that's worth doing. It's time well spent. Lastly, I just wanted to end with kind of my promotion of, you can help with historic preservation as well. And you can help build excitement as well for future generations. So one year, in 2019, we got our students involved with the This Place Matters campaign, because May was Preservation Month. And so this was a social media campaign put on by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And again, we were just trying to engage the students in a different way and meet them where they're at, which, in some cases is social media. You can also apply for historic roadside markers, which we did, and then we received the roadside marker in 2016, and we did the dedication event the following October in 2017. And that essentially is this grant program that happens through William G. Pomeroy Foundation. You have to, there's a lot involved in the process, but in the end, with help of those collaborating relationships and, great people that you can kind of bounce ideas off of, it's very doable and very manageable and worth it, because now we know approximately where the Florence Farming Association existed. And we know that there is activity there from approximately 1848 to 1860. It did last a little bit longer. There were some families that stayed later. We know that it was a settlement of free blacks. We know that it was promoted by Stephen Myers and other notable abolitionists. And the people in Florence didn't know that this was there. And, Florence today is, still very remote. And this was something that the community could be proud of, that this happened here in Florence. Other things that you can do to generate interest would be that if you do have skills in, historical research, mentor youth, share your skills with young people so that they can also become engaged in maybe conducting historical or archaeological research, and just having a general respect for history. That is such a big deal. Working with professionals in the field, if you have that access, that is huge for our students to be able to do more with history than just read about historical things that happened someplace else, somewhere else. And so that's kind of what, we had conducted these workshops as well, where Matt came in and worked with the students with some hands-on activities to help build those historical thinking skills. When we did this about a week prior to going out to do the field work. In other instances, I've had the students present to other students. So partnering with local events and local groups. This was Living History Day in Peterborough, New York in June of 2016. And students basically took, some component of the research that they had done and pulled together presentations to give to fifth graders at this Civil War Living History Day event. And, really gave those students the opportunity to go full circle with this and be able to share their knowledge that they had learned. And I think it was very empowering for them to have that opportunity. And last but not least, your role in any sort of charitable giving to public institutions, public history organizations is essential to the longevity of those groups. You're hearing on the news of organizations that are having to sell off artwork and pieces of their exhibit because, especially during this time, as museums are closed, many history institutions are closed or severely limited or restricted. It's really hard for them to sustain their paid staff and even to keep the lights on. So most historical organizations and museums are nonprofits. That means that we need volunteers. And I say we because I am a volunteer myself with the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum, and we need volunteers. We essentially, made the tough choice to not open our doors this season due to COVID and the many restrictions that we would have had to put on our volunteer staff. But if you can volunteer, volunteer. If you can give, and that's all I will say about that. But I do thank you so much for this opportunity, and thank you so much for attending and listening. And I would be happy to entertain some questions. My information is here. If you don't ask a question here, you can certainly email me your question. And yes, happy to entertain questions, Rebecca, if anything came up.